Today I'm joined by Darryl Cooper. He is the host of the MartyrMade podcast and the co-host of the Unraveling with Jocko Willink. And I am very, very happy to to say hello to you today. Welcome to the Subversive Podcast.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me. I don't do a lot of these. I say no to a lot of interviews, but I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to have you here. The first kind of contact I've had with your work was through the infamous BoomerCon thread that you made. I think it was in the summer, which got a lot of traction in all sorts of corners, and people were just, I think, ranting and raving about it for about 2 weeks at least. And it was just such a perfect piece of content. It was if I can describe it, it was you saying, I understand the mind of the BoomerCon and here is why, and you list, I don't know, what was it, 20 or 30 pieces of incontrovertible, even Snopes proof evidence that no one could refute of why people are a bit the BoomerCon is a bit suspicious of the January 6th or the, essentially how Trump was treated and also the recent election. So it was just a wonderful thing, and it spun out in many, many quote tweets, and everyone wanted to talk about it. So I wanted to first praise you for that. It was a great thing. I'm curious, like, how did that impact you? I guess, it lifted your platform somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, I think I had 7,000 Twitter followers when I posted that thread. And those are all people, for the most part, that were like hardcore fans of the podcast, my big long form history podcast. And so that thread was put out there to those people. It was just an intimate thing between me and those people that I spent a lot of time with in one way or another. And it was crazy. I mean, I saw that it was kind of going a little bit viral, but then I had a bunch of stuff to do that day. And then somebody called me up around like 5:30 that day and said, turn on Fox News right now. And Tucker was on there talking about it. And then Donald Trump he said my name in the CPAC speech the next day and called me a brilliant podcaster.
Well, you are a brilliant podcaster.
I should put that in my Twitter bio, but and I think so. Yeah, I think I had like 7,000 Twitter followers, and now I've got like 110,000. And it's been very interesting. It gives me a sort of a certain problem to work through, right? Because I went from 7,000 to 110,000 followers, and obviously just because of what that thread was about and who was sharing it and how it got put around, I don't know, 80, 90,000 of those new followers are people who maybe like I was describing in that thread, who are not necessarily, my politics in a lot of ways are further to the right than Attila the Hun. So like, I'm constitutionally and like temperamentally, emotionally on the side of those people, but I'm also probably far, far outside the Overton window that any of them could tolerate. And so figuring out how to communicate with those people, communicate certain ideas with them, because I love those people. These are the people I grew up with. They're my aunts and uncles and grandparents. And a lot of us feel that way. Even people who pretend to have contempt for those people to get by in their social lives, they came from those places. And whether they say so or not, there's like a part of you that gets damaged every time you remain silent when people are talking shit about your family and your hometown and the people and values that you grew up with. And I'm unapologetic in the fact that I don't feel like I need to justify it or rationalize it or provide a reasonable argument for it. I'm just on the side of those people, the normal people whose goals in life consist of raising a good family and having a comfortable retirement and making sure that their kids are all right. Those are the people whose side I'm on, and anybody who makes that more difficult wittingly or unwittingly is not on my side.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I like the idea of politics to the right of Attila the Hun. It's I think that's, at least in my perspective, that's the main divide that I see now on the right. You've described the the mind of the boomercon. But there's definitely a schism. There's a shift, and there are people like us. I would probably be to the right of Attila the Hun in many ways as well, and that's kind of my interest as well. And the people that I have on this podcast tend to be in that sphere as well. But yeah, I think a major challenge for content creators like us is to digest the information that lies beyond the gates and make it palatable for the people who essentially have the money to sponsor, to promote a lot of the things that go on politically. Even if they're not the richest people, they're the silent majority is still where where people can actually put money into politics or get things done. So I think your podcast does that very well. And I just also wanted to say this: you have just an amazing way of processing information and a gift for storytelling. I have to say, like the fact that you can, I know how hard it is to research a podcast, to do it on your own, because the conversation's easy. That's why I'm doing this as a conversation. To me,
for me, it's not, honestly. That's why I don't do this stuff. I get really nervous usually in conversations, and I'm pretty reclusive, which is weird considering the fact that I have a podcast. But yeah, the fact that I can sit in my cave and like really just dial in and work on something by myself until I feel like I have it right is way easier for me. I'm pretty like, I got a little bit of social anxiety. That's why I don't do many interviews and stuff. So
yeah, well, you're very good at it. I just want to give you a lot of praise because I think I did just one episode like that. And like at the end of it, I recorded it in one go and I tend to speak really fast and I was just drenched. This was
yeah. Oh, I'm the same way. Yeah.
It's a very challenging. So I don't know. I think it's probably to each their own. Everyone's very good at what they're good at. But yeah, it's a very special skill, and I think you're using it to big effect.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think figuring out how to tell good stories is what this is all about, right? Even if you're dealing in nonfiction or if you're dealing in ideas, you have to build a story around those ideas, because that's how people understand things, and how they relate things to their past and future is through narrativization. It's like a basic function of the human mind, right? Take in new information and fit it into an ongoing story that you've got going. And we if you look politically, for example, like one of the things that happened when Donald Trump when he was running in the primary, right, is he turned things like approval for the Iraq War in the Republican Party among the base on its head, like overnight. He was in South Carolina and he said this whole war was a lie and it was a terrible idea. And people were like, "Oh, this is it. He's tanked. He's finished." And it was the exact opposite. And I think like the reason why is, people knew by that point that like this was that they were, that the Republican Party and the Republican base were like carrying around like this burden, like they were never going to get out from under it because it was their war. It was a Republican war. And, somebody had to come along and give them permission, give them a framework that would allow them to say, no, this was a bad idea. And by saying that, we're not siding with Nancy Pelosi and all that entails. We're siding with our own side and our own people, but we now have like a way of talking about this war that allows us to express what was really like the building feeling underneath the surface for a long time. And so like right now, my next major series for MartyrMade, my podcast, is on the history of the American labor movement. And that was my plan. It was the next series that was coming up before my big thread blew up and I got all these new followers. And I considered that almost like I look at that almost like a major responsibility now, because I have a lot of these folks on the right who are, it's an incredible time among like for the potential in the like normie conservative sphere right now. It's just such you have a bunch of people who have been locked into like just decrepit ideologies on, class relations and economics and militarism, all of the police state for that matter, all of these things for decades. And right now there's this massive, massive opening to get people to reconsider that. And so, I had actually like my first 2 episodes of that series pretty well mapped out. And once I got all of these new followers from this very specific place, I just was like, okay, I have to like reorient the way that I'm going to tell this story, because there's going to be a lot of people in here that the minute I say the word anarchist, talking about someone like Parsons in the Haymarket Affair or something, they're just going to that's it. They're done, right? They're going to see Antifa in their head and they're finished. And so, figuring out how to tell that story in a way that that lets people know that this is the best part of America. That the labor movement is one of the best stories in our history, and that these are some of like the great heroes of American history. And even if they are anarchists, some of them, even that these were the common people who were rising up to renegotiate the power relationship that they had, inherited really from like British colonial times. It's a great American story. But you have to tell it in a certain way that's going to get past those triggers and those filters that have been built in for so long.
Yeah, you make a really good point here, and it's something that I probably fail at myself because I feel like I'm a bit of a shepherd of people out of like the IDW space, which is a lot of kind of formal leftists, maybe a little bit of boomer conservatives that follow me for my feminism takes. People like that type of stuff, but mostly it's people who have kind of the IDW or intellectual dark web is a bit exhausted. It has no solutions. It's like it's just podcasting until it's dying breath. And in a way, I've kind of managed to build an audience in that sphere, but I've also not really catered my message enough. I think that's a very good approach of yours to explain stuff, because sometimes I just like, okay, I feel like, oh, the arguments have been made. Let's start from we're 80% of the way through and we're just talking about the details here. But sometimes I just get people asking me like, so what's wrong with liberalism? And I'm like, hi, I'm not going to tell you again. I've told you many times. Listen to my earlier stuff. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an interesting space to be in, but I think you've got the right approach there.
Great. Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of with my podcast is, like my first series was on the early history of Zionism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict up to 1948. And, I think I read between 70 and 80 books. I read 1,500, 2,000 articles, papers, diary. I read literally just about everything I could find for a couple of years before I even started that thing. And I really tried to present the perspective of the European Jews before, the modern advent of political Zionism in the world that they were coming out of as saw it, and also to portray the invasion of Palestine by these colonists from the perspective of the Arabs and the Palestinians. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is I have gotten a couple hundred emails from Israeli Jews, including some of them who are active duty IDF serving in the West Bank territories, who have written and told me that listening to my podcast softened them up on the Palestinians and gave them it's actually affected the way that they interact with the people they see on a daily basis. And I've gotten a couple hundred emails rather, from Arabs around the region who said that it changed the way that they looked at like the Jewish situation when they were first coming in. And, and then I've gotten a couple hundred emails from both sides saying I'm a shill for the other side, but that's always going to happen. So, I have to be able to do that, right? I mean, the thing is, like, there's very little in history that, other than communism, and even that I consider it a fault of like my own fault in a way. Even though I have trouble accepting this emotionally, I still consider it kind of my own fault. Communism is really the only thing I have no sympathy for whatsoever, and that and that knowing its history only radicalizes me further against it. Right? It's about the only thing. Just about everything else, when you're dealing with ethnicities, when you're dealing with nations and tribes and peoples and those type of things, the better you know the history, the easier it is to have sympathy for both sides usually. And so we do ourselves a service when we pay attention to the arguments of another side, unless they're communists. And like when I did a series on the history of Jim Jones and People's Temple, the suicide cult back in the 60s and 70s. And when the reason I did that, I did that series is because I was reading a book about it, and I'd heard about drink the Kool-Aid and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't know. It's in the popular culture. You think that this would be a major thing, that 75% of the people that died out there in the jungle were Black people. And specifically, they were mostly older Black people and the kids of these people who had come over to the Bay Area as part of the Great Migration. And so I was like, well, that's obviously like a massively key part of this story, right? Like if 75% of the people that committed suicide out there, talking 900 something people, had been first generation immigrants from Mexico, we'd be like, well, that's the key part of the story we have to talk about, right? And so I started researching it, and it drew me into this like long 7-episode, probably 30-hour long project, kind of starting from the 1950s and walking through like the rise and kind of peaking and radicalization of the protest and civil rights movements, and then its collapse into violence and insanity as you get into the late 60s and early 70s. And in order to do that, like, I know that I'm going to have a lot of people who are listening who are like, if you criticize anything that's going on with the civil rights movement or the protest movement in the 60s, they're automatically going to classify it as something that they really are going to be prejudiced against, like, immediately. And so I made it very clear, those people, like, by bringing the historical context to the Great Migration and everything into it, that I have sympathy for the causes that were behind these things. Now here's what happened, and I think, again, that one also sort of helped a lot of people understand what happened back then.
Yeah, that's definitely news to me. That's super interesting. I remember I actually listened because I was interested in that as well, and I listened to a few podcasts, and not your one, unfortunately, and they never mentioned that little tidbit. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
You also had a podcast on kind of the Bolshevik takeover of Russia, and this is kind of a subject that's close to me regionally and in terms of my family because we have a lot of stories about this event in my family. My grandparents on my mother's side were both in Moldova when the Soviets came in, and they were kind of telling Soviets, trading stories about the Soviets and the Nazis and who treated them better. And surprisingly, it was the Nazis. The Nazis were
It's not that surprising.
very mild in comparison to the Bolsheviks. And I mean, this is just probably one of the more horrendous pieces of family lore. But my grandmother was from a family with a lot of sisters, and she was the eldest sister. And when the Soviets came in, they heard, a few days before that they were, going to come in, and they dug some form. Essentially, they dug a rape bunker under an area that they wouldn't discover. But one of the girls, and I don't remember if it was one of my grandmother's sisters or one of the neighbors. I mean, this is my grandmother died a long time ago. Can't fact check. But they were hearing her get raped by the soldiers, but they didn't want to make a sound because they were all hiding and under. And they said they killed all of their livestock. They didn't take it for food. They just massacred everything in their wake, and they didn't burn down the villages, but they were just completely just. And they said they had no problems with the German soldiers, but the Soviets were just almost like the Mongol hordes when they came through. So yeah, I don't know what to say. That's just like one piece of family lore that's happened to someone close to me, but. Yeah, there's millions of stories like that.
Yeah, one of the things I said in that series or in that podcast episode was that whether or not one was worse than the other, like it's not a conversation you can have like in our society, and so I don't have it with people. It's not worth having, But like, I can tell you which one scares me more, and for sure, the Bolshevik regime scares me more for the simple reason that. I recognize the Nazis basically. Hitler is basically a warlord with badass panzer tanks and a very well organized technological military machine. I think him and Genghis Khan would have recognized each other or something like that, right? The Soviet regime, and especially up until 56 de-Stalinization, I don't think the world's ever seen anything like that. Don't think the world had seen anything like what was going on there. I mean, it was an eruption of what we used to call Satanism world. The scary thing about the Nazis is like what they might do in order to get control of you. The scary thing about the Soviets is what they were going to do once they got control of you. And, that's a frightening thing. I mean, throughout the entire period of the 1930s, And again, the Nazis conducted themselves in the East quite barbarically in terms of like the way they conducted the war. I don't defend the way that they, their reprisal tactics and things were something that, other European countries had to a large extent moved past, although that's exaggerated to a large degree when you get into what Churchill was doing and stuff during the Second World War. But not to defend that, but still, like you go from 1933 when they took over up to 1939 when the war broke out, and the Nazi regime had executed about 10,000 people, and a lot of those people were communists who threw a bomb and actual people who needed to be executed. A good number of those people were subversive, caught spying for the Soviet Union, for example. About 10,000 people in 6 years. The Soviet Union was killing 10,000 people a day sometimes. It's unbelievable. And it's just hard to fathom. It really is. Like it's the one thing that just is still completely, like I went through, I've read books about like I got on an Aztec kick for a while. I've read a lot of books about Mesoamericans and the Aztecs. And on some level, I feel like I understand what they were about. And when I look at the Soviet regime, again, the up through, especially the early period, when they were, tearing down churches or turning them into brothels and porn theaters and doing things like that. I mean, this is just an eruption of evil into the world in my eyes. And again, like I always try to make it a rule to tell myself that if that's how I see something, then it's probably because there's just a piece of the puzzle that I don't quite have yet. But I certainly don't have it because I have no tolerance for it. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of the core of what also my family observed was that they took the most toxic elements of society and took their resentment and turned that into a force, and that force was big enough to tear down everything, and it was big enough to act locally because you don't even need a centralized, you don't need to direct the village alcoholic or slacker or maybe mentally ill person who's already violent to start murdering people. You just need to say go, and they do.
Mhm.
And that's what they did. And resentment is a very, very powerful force. And like you said, it's pretty much demonic. I mean, if you were to just imagine the devil in one feeling, in one urge, it would be that resentment turned to revenge against creation itself. And yeah, I think that's what communism does best. That's the crystallized resentment right there. So yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I wonder, do you think we can conserve anything? Can there be any conservatism without kind of a metaphysical level, without God? Is there any way that politics can maintain itself, can have any sort of stable founding without anchoring itself in something metaphysical and believing in something higher? Because to me, it feels in a way that, liberalism in a way is entropy. I think Curtis Yarvin makes this point.
Right.
And it's continual decay if you do not anchor it in something. But anchoring it in something would mean that you would have to declare your principles and stick to them. They're non-negotiable, and you don't, start deciding that tomorrow, oh no, we've evolved, we have moral evolution. So I don't know what's your feeling about that, because I'm a bit conflicted about it as well.
Well, I mean, you something you said is perfect. Is that leftism or liberalism, if you like, is not it's not a program. It's a process, right? And it's a process it's a process like rust, and it'll continue until it's arrested by another force, right? And that's always the challenge, because what it means is it doesn't suffer from being lazy for a generation or something. It can always just pick up where it left off. Whereas the side that's trying to preserve, you can't let your guard down at all, because eventually, the minute you do that, and the zombie is going to punch through that window, and now that you have to deal with that, and now you can't cover the under. It just, becomes leaks in the dam at all times. And maybe the ancient wisdom is that you can't hold it off forever. Ragnarok's always going to come, and order's going to break down. But that's not a reason for despair. As far as one of the whether or not we can conserve anything over the long term without God or the transcendent. I'm skeptical of that, but I'll say that maybe maybe another way, and I'm not sure that this would work, but maybe another way, and maybe this is a different way of saying the same thing, but is to get away from this tendency that we have, especially on the American right. The left does not suffer from this so much. This is, God, it's the cancer of every libertarian and IDW person out there, is that you have to defend all of your positions. If you can't get into an argument with Ben Shapiro about it and defeat him, then you have to change your mind. And that is ridiculous. I mean, it is perfectly fine to say, no, this is how I don't even know why I feel the way I feel about this, but I feel very strongly about it. And the fact that you've got a higher verbal IQ than I do, is not going to talk me out of it. There's lots of things that I believe fully that if I were to sit down, with the right person, they'd kick my ass in a debate. And anybody that watched it, even people that agreed with me, would be like, oh man, Darryl got his ass kicked. But he's not going to change my mind on that. And people say, well, then you're not open-minded, you're not flexible, or you're not thinking for yourself, or whatever it is. That is just nonsense. It's perfectly fine to defer to tradition, defer to custom, defer to people that you look up to and trust and admire, or the history of your society or civilization. You're one person. You're 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 years old or whatever. And, you've been thinking about this issue part-time, off and on, for some period of your life. Chances are that the inherited idea that you got on that from your family, from your society, is something that people have been working over and thinking about and putting into practice to see how it actually holds up for 1,000 years or for 500 years. And to simply say that, even if this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, that that guy, he argues a little bit better than I do, and I got to say he's got some good points, I'm going to defer to, my family and my society and my traditions. And because I'm not wise enough to overrule them, and that doesn't mean that you shut your own rational faculty off. It works similar to the way that doubt versus dogma works in the Catholic Church, right? It's like, you have the church doctrine. This is like a huge difference between the Catholic Church and Protestant Church, right? The Orthodox as well, is that, if you go to a Protestant church, and the Christians in my family are all Protestant, and I love all those people. And I even have a certain amount of love for Protestantism in general, but it's that you go to church on Sunday and you're going to hear what the preacher learned in Bible school, or what he's thought about since then, or some books he's read, or whatever. And that's what you're going to hear. You go to an Orthodox national church or to the Catholic Church, and you can go ask the priest a question. Why do bad things happen to good people? And he can say, well, it's interesting that you asked that, because we've actually been talking about that for 1,500 years. In fact, our very best and most hip people have been thinking about that for 1,500 years. And it gets better. We wrote it all down. And so we have this entire long tradition. And after all that, here is where we're at right now. Doesn't mean it's not necessarily going to change at some point in the future, but this is where we're at. And that's the doctrine. And so maybe that's something that you're just gosh, that just doesn't I really have trouble, with that one, right? The Catholic teachings say on gay marriage is that you can't have gay marriage or abortion, but you're a modern person, you grew up in modern America, and you just can't quite emotionally get it, right? That's fine, actually. What you do is you say, I'm going to defer to this grand tradition, to this, to this tradition that has been handed down to me, that people far smarter, far more committed, good, pure people, pure soul, have been working over with everything in their guts, for 1,500 years. I'm going to defer to them on it. And so that's the infallibility of the doctrine or whatever, right? Is that deferral. But then the doubt's perfectly fine. Doubt is your road to wisdom. It's you wrestling with that. You may wrestle with the Catholic doctrine on gay marriage or abortion until the day you die. And that's fine, because in that wrestling, you're going to be exploring different spiritual avenues and different intellectual avenues. And I think, take that outside of religious ideas. And I think that, is something that we really need to more confidently put forward, that you can simply believe things. And so the reason this was my answer to your question on that is by simply saying that, like, no, this is the idea that we represent, period. It's in a way making it an eternal principle, by saying that we don't have to defend it, doesn't require defense, is another way of saying that it's sacred in a way, it's inviolable, and it's really the only way to defend against an opposition, which has a much easier job, which is to poke holes and break down and hinder. It's just a much easier job than building and preserving. It takes a lot less energy, and it's a lot easier to, if you have a if you have a controversial issue and two people are going to get put up on a stage to debate it, the person who has to shoot down, the system of ideas that you're going to be talking about is going to have an easier job.
Exactly, and they are also able to present the framing of the problem as well, because I feel like that's a big problem that we have on the right, because the left always is much 10 steps ahead with framing every issue. Like, for example, a very apt example of what you were talking about before is the question of trans children. I feel like we're at the point where even the right has to be wrestling within the framework that the left has set out. The fact that, one, trans people are what they say they are. Two, that live and let live is the best thing to apply to this. Three, that children can consent in certain parameters. And now you have people on the conservative end, social conservatives as well, arguing about should it be 16, 17, or 18-year-olds that can chop off their genitals or get top surgery or any other euphemism you want to add to that. So it's the fact that anytime you want to have any sort of socially conservative conversation, you're already like, the maelstrom is already like 10, 20, 30 steps ahead, and you're haggling over minute details of the enemy's frame. That, because that's the problem I feel for conservatives. They accepted liberalism as the idea that live and let live. Well, live and let live is this maelstrom. Live and let live is ripping every little substructure that you've built your civilization on with every conversation. The idea that, like you said, everything has to be haggled over in the marketplace of ideas. These people are much better hagglers than you, because you actually don't have any argument. Why shouldn't children consent? Why is a child less free than an adult? Why should it be 17? Why shouldn't it be 14? It's all like arbitrary. And it's true. Like, if you look at that from that perspective, why some 17-year-olds are very mature. I've met 17-year-olds who are very mature. So, like you said, it's so easy to shoot down. And yeah, it's people should get much more comfortable with saying, this is it. These are my principles, and it's also something to be respected. I feel like if someone just shows up and is stalwart and just is filled and confident about where they stand, I think that's something that people haven't seen in a while. And I feel like maybe that's what people like Donald Trump brought to the scene. He had a cocky confidence that was just flew in the face of all of this negotiating, the haggling marketplace of ideas. He had, maybe 10 ideas. They were fixed. They were not necessarily very evolved or interesting. You wouldn't write op-eds about it. But they were, predictable, and he was very confident about asserting them. So I think that's something people are missing.
Yeah, the right is never going to, like, we're in a moment right now, right, where the right is on the margins, and obviously the left and liberalism owns the center, owns all the institutions and so forth. So right now, the meme is that the left can't meme, right? And that's true right now. They're the establishment, and the establishment is never really that good at memeing, and it's much easier to sort of be the subversive group when you're on the outside. But it's to me, like, the right is never going to be successful long term by positioning it, like, by trying to be out edgy, or out edgy the left, or out subversive the left, or anything like that, because eventually, hopefully, you're going to be back in power, or at least something like that, and then if that's what you're trying to do, it's like what the left's trying to do now. They're trying to still be subversive and still be edgy, but they're in the center now, and it's not working. And so they look silly and stupid doing it. If those roles get reversed, then we're going to find ourselves in the same position. And the right has to represent itself and attract people through strength and through aesthetics and through confidence. That's the only way that the right. It's what makes the right worth having at all. Is by embodying those principles. People need to look at it, and some people are always going to look at it and say, "Yeah, those are the boring, stodgy old conservatives or whatever." But other people are going to look and be like, "Damn, they're strong, they're confident, like they stand on principle, and not in the David French sense." The right has to learn that. It's understandable, right? So, like, if you look at just take it back a little ways, the way this stuff went down. I mean, there was like a deep power structure in this country that existed for a long time from the founding, right? You had your like old Anglo power structure that started to sort of spread out all over the country when you got up into the post-Civil War period. And by the time you get up to like the 1880s, 1890s, it's very difficult to for this power structure to run a country that spans from Philadelphia to Seattle and all of this. And so it's very difficult. It takes a long time to put somebody on a train and send them over there and just for that group. And so they came up with something. They came up with progressive movement, capital P, right? Which was to create all of these managerial institutions that were going to get control of the fact that like you had all these, these Irish and Italian immigrants that had taken over all the big cities and all this kind of stuff. We're going to take away the power of that a little bit. And this was the progressive movement, the early progressive movement in a lot of ways was an Anglo reassertion of power. If you look at like, the second KKK, which was obviously an Anglo sort of only movement by definition, right? It started out, I think, in Atlanta in 1915, but it really didn't take root in the South at all. It took root up in the Midwest and in the Western cities like Portland and Chicago and Cleveland and all these cities. And there weren't really any Black people up there at that time. The Great Migration hadn't really started yet. And so what were they concerned with? They didn't really talk much about Black people. They were talking about Jews and immigrants and Catholics. And if you look like during the 1920s, during Prohibition, you had a lot of these KKK groups that were going out and assassinating bootleggers and intercepting like bootleg alcohol shipments. The KKK was big on Prohibition. And so like there was an extent to which there was this Anglo reassertion of power that happened from say like, the 1880s or 90s up until like the 1920s or 30s. And when you get up to the 1960s, that what was left of that power structure by the 1960s just completely collapsed and fell apart during Vietnam and during the protest movement. They lost a lot of their children. I don't mean in Vietnam. They lost a lot of them sort of ideologically to the universities and to the protest movement that was going on. And it just didn't pass down. And they lost their confidence. That power structure that was there lost its confidence. And the same thing happened with the Catholic power structure, which had actually built up as quite a powerful cultural force by that point. I mean, it was the Catholic League of Decency that was maintaining like obscenity standards on motion pictures, for example, up until the 60s. A lot of that kind of stuff came from the Catholics. And just because the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s just delegitimized those two groups profoundly. And the field was just left open after that. And we're still kind of living with the consequences of it. You have, people like this animal who ran over all these people in Wisconsin recently. You read Pedro Gonzalez's article about, all of this, just this guy's entire life. I mean, this guy is somebody who in any society prior to, a Western European or American country, or a Western European or Anglo country until about like 1950 would have been like executed long ago. I mean, this is a person that would have been handled or dealt with in some way. And he's just been going through wrecking people's lives for his entire life without any real consequences. And the reason for that, part of the reason for it, I mean, I know there's some people out there who think that like this is all kind of some big part of a grand plan, I don't necessarily think it requires that. It might be a grand plan of Satan's, but it is that people are so terrified of that 20 or 30 years from now, they're going to be the person with the fire hose shooting it at like the Freedom Riders. And people are going to look back at that picture and be like, oh my God, these people were obviously wrong and evil or whatever. And they don't want to be the person who was shooting the fire hose at the Freedom Riders. And they're so obsessed with not being that person that they let people, they refuse to intervene against people like this guy. And it's a massive lack of confidence. It was the Cultural Revolution, the Vietnam War in the 1960s. And the realization, this is the thing, right? Like the realization that there was a great deal of racial injustice in the country, like prior to the 1960s, and the widespread acceptance of that by the white population of the country. It's something that ought to be recognized as a massive, like, and quite unique moral advancement among a people. Something that a people of their own volition, without being forced to through violence or anything like that, like realized that what they were doing was unjust and made massive sacrificial changes to do that. And instead, it's something that is used against those people. Their own moral sense is used against them, and it's hard to get over. We're still, I think, I don't know if it'll outlast the boomers. And I do think that the left and liberals have probably pushed their luck with the trans and the Islamic terror issues. I think those were two issues that they just sort of maybe hit the wall where people said, okay, we've got 9/11, we've got, 2016, we've got a terrorist attack happening every week, just about somewhere in Europe or whatever. And you can't even, there's arguments over whether you can say it's Islamic terror or and you take that. And then obviously the trans children thing, which I think if you put it to an honest, anonymous vote, 90% of the people in this country think is insane. I think, I hope that those two issues were probably the rocks that their ship is going to run up on. If not, if this line of defense doesn't hold, then especially the trans children thing, I despair to picture where they're going to go next.
Yeah. Especially with COVID and seeing how people bend all over the world to some pretty insane intrusions into their daily lives. It's made me a bit hopeless in terms of how people react to politics. Because with every new encroachment on civil liberties or just I don't know, having your children see other people on the street, just a very, very basic human aspects of life. Um, People are not only bending to it, they're somehow bringing it into their personal narrative and making it part of who they are. And there's even I have friends from high school who are warring with me about vaccines and stuff like that. So they're now in the vaccine system. They're special people. They're good people. They're making the vaccines, and they're hating the people who don't take the vaccines. And it is pretty crazy how efficient this media machine is in meaning making, especially for people who don't really have any other meaning. And it's a gift that keeps on giving. Like every 6 months, there's another thing that the people who are slightly unhinged can latch onto and bring into their personal narrative and gain meaning from. There was George Floyd. Now there's like children here in Hicksville, Romania. They talk about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. They've barely ever seen a Black person in their life, but it's an important meaning making motor for so many people.
Sure. Yeah. And like you said, it's fertile ground when people don't have, a system of symbols that they're already rooted and grounded in. and people today. I mean, this is one of the things, if you want to talk about broad history and like where things are headed. I think that one thing that the dissident right is very correct about in general. As much as I love paleocons, I think, I don't think I've probably ever met a paleocon that I didn't love. But the one thing I think that the dissident right, non-paleocon dissident right, is correct about is that you cannot go backwards. It's just not going to happen. The community structures that, the local institutions, the relationships, the strong family units that supported the society that you want to go back to do not exist anymore. The religious belief that existed, none of that exists anymore. And we have to just accept that and deal with it. I mean, we can try to do things that are going to contribute to rebuilding those things, but that's a multi-generational project. It takes one generation to destroy all those things. We don't know how long it takes to rebuild all those things. That's a totally, that's an organic process, that takes place under certain conditions that encourage it. And right now we don't have any of those things. And so you have to ask, like, what historical moment can we look to in history, for example, to, everybody likes to talk about, the United States and the Roman Empire at the late Republic period. And it's a little bit trite to bring it up, obviously, but there are very interesting things to learn about, right? Like if you look at what happened when Rome conquered Carthage and took over the Mediterranean, they start importing millions of slaves back to Italy, and all of these citizen farmers that had been Roman citizens who had been they provide their own armor and they go out during the war season to support, the glory of Rome. They start losing their land to these massive economies of scale that are, the result of these slaves that are coming in, and they flood into the cities, and all of the family structures and all of the sort of interlocking relationships that existed out in the rural countryside among these people in their villages and in their, their nearby farms. You go into the city and they're living in big tenement buildings, and all of that goes away. And what you've got now is you've got an urban mob, the famous urban mob, and they start to get demagogues, and then you get the whole cycle, right? And I mean, nobody needs to, the parallels are so obvious that, again, it becomes trite to mention it. We didn't have a bunch of slaves. We had the Industrial Revolution. And so instead of having these massive economies of scale with slaves, it was, with machinery and illegal immigrants, I guess, which is part of that. But and so you go into the Great Depression, and you see a parallel process happening in the United States and in the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, you've got Joseph Stalin in the early 30s doing things like the Holodomor. And if you look at what was the Holodomor about? What was he doing? Did he just not like Ukrainians? Yeah, I didn't like Ukrainians, sure. But what he was doing was trying to do an accelerated industrialization, urbanization of the Soviet Union. You had all these independent farmers spread out there with their little patches of land. Maybe they had a couple dozen acres or something. And that's not efficient. What we need is big factory farms that can just put, certain cash crops over 10,000 acres, and it's all going to be run by expensive machinery. And all the rest of you people who are running all these farms, we need you in the cities building the tractors and doing these things. And so the people out there were, they said, no, thank you. And so he forced them to do it. You look over at the United States during the Great Depression, it wasn't that ugly, but you had armed sheriffs going out and evicting millions of people from their farms during the Great Depression. And it was because of, there's an economic downturn and they couldn't pay their debts and so on and so forth. But the reality of it is state power was going out there and forcing millions of people off of their farms. Those people were flooding into the cities looking for work. So it has this sort of voluntary mask a little bit compared to something like the Soviet Union. But at the end of the day, the same process is taking place. And one way or another was going to take place, probably. It was going to be forced. It's something you can maybe think of today similarly, what people point out all the time, how when it comes to surveillance technology, the use of surveillance technology and things in population management, that China always seems to be just 10 years ahead of us. And that whatever they do, it's they're doing by force and just, we don't care. We're just going to do it. Things that we do sort of by, there's a crisis, so we have to do this, and, maybe just sort of push it out into the market and people will buy these, whatever it is. But the same process is happening. And now we've got a government that surveils our population as much as China did 10 years ago. And, these are things that we have to contend with that are very difficult. Especially when you talk about, what's going on today. Like, one of the questions I ask myself all the time, and sorry I'm talking so much, these Jocko Go energy drinks, which everybody should buy, are very effective. Is that one of the questions I ask myself all the time is, what happens when you have a ruling class, a ruling regime that has like legitimacy among themselves and like 5% of their hangers on? Virtually nobody supports them. But they have propaganda and surveillance technology that allows them to maintain control long past a point where they would have been overthrown in the past. That's a very interesting question,
I also wanted to ask you about the recent Kyle Rittenhouse verdict. I know this isn't like a big historical theme. I try to make this podcast timeless as well, but it seems to be like an interesting. I feel like it's a pretty monumental event from many perspectives, and you had this extraordinary podcast about it recently, where you shared your perspective. So, what do you think this means? Because it's a positive, it's a win for our side. But what do you think this verdict means in the context of what's coming up for the right wing?
I think it depends on how we respond to it and how we use it. Like I said, the problem on our side for 50 years now has been just a total collapse in confidence. And that confidence is what has to be rebuilt. If you think of like something like libertarianism, for example, is in a lot of ways, I know this gets said a lot, but it really is true. It's like, it's a retreat for conservatives. It's a place where they can go and be like, I'm libertarian, don't hurt me, right? And so Ben Shapiro can be against gay marriage his whole career. And then once like public opinion kind of like passes that 51% mark on it, now he's libertarian on the issue. It's like, oh, the state should stay out of marriage. And it's just sort of like that retreat, right? And we have to get enough confidence to not need a retreat like that. So this is like, if you want the peaceful sort of optimistic hope of what could happen, right? And I'll get to Rittenhouse in 1 second. My sort of big grand hope, a way that we can avoid civil war collapse or Bolshevik tyranny, is that something that I do see happening on the ground, people I know, but you see it in voting patterns as well, is that Latinos in America are starting to turn on the left. And a lot of them are not buying into a lot of the identity politics. Sure, the ones they ship off to college and stuff, some of them are buying into it, but a lot of them are not buying into it. They see the left encouraging African-American race riots in the cities, and they do not like that. And you're really starting to see a change. And if that continues, and if you get more Pedro Gonzalez's out there, I really think that that would be the thing that the right needs to regain the confidence to actually stand on something. Because it's a lot easier to stand up to somebody who's calling you a racist when you got two brown guys on either side of you. And that sort of alliance between the conservative Latino population. I lived up north of where I am now. I'm in San Diego, and I lived up near Oxnard not too long ago. Worked at a DoD installation, and there's a lot of strawberry fields and other agricultural fields around that area, and most of it is worked by immigrants. Some, a lot of illegal immigrants, but a lot of just people who are Americans now who live there and work the fields. And I would drive into work from Los Angeles, and I would get in there at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. And these people are out there like bent over, in the fields at 5:30 in the morning. And, when they finish like filling up like a basket or a box, they put that thing over their head and they don't walk, they run to the truck to deposit it, because they don't get paid by the hour. They get paid like by how much they pick. And I'll never forget like the first time, and it happened every day, but the first time I ever noticed it, I was driving in and through one of these really poor neighborhoods. It's trailers and kind of like trailers with like bootlegged electrical wires, like connecting them all together so that they could share their electricity, things like that, and all immigrants. And I was driving in, and there was a school bus with all the kids like waiting to pick them up and bring them to school. And these were like middle schoolers. These were like 7th, 8th grade kids. And if there were 50 kids there, 40, 50 kids, there were at least 30 parents there. And they were putting their kids on, they were hugging their kids and putting them on the bus. And when they were leaving, the parents were like waving to them. This wasn't like the first day of school. This was just a day. It was like a Wednesday in the middle of the year. And I saw that and I was like, damn, like, there's some cultural issues and some various other things that like you always need to work through when you deal with like an immigrant population. But I want those people on my side. Like anybody who is like, I didn't get walked out to the school bus when I was a kid. I don't know anybody who got walked out to the school bus and had their parents waving to them like as they were going off. Like that's a concerned parent, and a concerned parent is the most powerful person that you can possibly have on the right. Because it comes down to like the way you open the conversation, or close to the beginning, asking about God. Is it comes down to like a question about concern for the future, and I hope that like maybe a lot of what we're seeing right now. Normally you have like a generational turnover every 20 years or so, and not had that happen because the boomers have held on to power much, much longer than most generations do. And the millennials, as a result of that, have not been able to move forward in their careers and start families and buy houses and do all the things that people normally do when they hit their 20s and 30s. And so you have like, among millennials, like people aren't getting married until late. All of that's been delayed. And so this period of time where, that normally you'd have maybe 20 years of like sort of leftward movement and political correctness. And then like the generations would turn over and there'd be sort of a pushback because the generations that were pushing it kind of like, the millennials, just like the people in the 60s, everybody, you go back to like the 1960s and people are like, oh my God, when these people are in power, it is just going to be, the 1980s are going to be insane, right? And it turned out that like, no, not really. Those people had kids and like whatever. And yeah, eventually, like, when they were senators and CEOs and stuff, we have some problems. But a lot of that also, I think, is due to the fact that millennials identify with their grandparents, like all kids do, more than their parents. And so, hopefully, as millennials start to move into that next stage, they finally start to be able to buy houses and so on and so forth. If BlackRock doesn't buy them all, then things will start to change. I totally got away from your question. So, Rittenhouse, right? So, yeah. I think that like the thing that I wanted to talk, the reason I did that episode, like, a lot of my history listeners, they don't want to hear me talk that much about politics. And so I usually don't, on my podcast, unless I have something like sort of metapolitical or maybe a historical point to make. And, I think we really need to recognize that we're in a very unique moment in American history. Like, I don't think that you go back to the 1960s. You go back to the 1960s when you had millions of people protesting. I mean, if you think about it now, if you go watch a documentary in the 60s, you'd think that like everybody was a protester except for, William F. Buckley or something. But you go back there and all of the things that were happening, especially the uglier side of it, you didn't have any Democratic politicians shilling for the Black Liberation Army or the Weather Underground. You had some radical chic celebrities and so on and so forth, but whatever. Like, they didn't have any institutional support. It was a Democratic mayor, Daley, Richard Daley in Chicago, that ordered the police to go crack down on the protesters and rioters in 1968 at the Democratic Convention. Nobody was down with that kind of stuff. When you started getting violent, when you started like going outside the institutions to like, people recognize that this is a systemic breakdown that will destroy everything. Like the minute we sort of start tolerating that. And, if you would have had one of the vice presidential candidates during, the 1968 election, go out during the Martin Luther King assassination riots and start bailing people out after they burned down a police station, or saying on TV that the riots should not stop, that person would have got dropped from the ticket, and every Democrat would have cheered that. We're in a very, very different and strange and quite alarming time right now. And I think a lot of people don't quite recognize it because they have total control over the propaganda apparatus, and because we've sort of been like frog boiled into it, although it has ramped up very quickly. And obviously that has led to a lot of people really waking up. But like, you're in a very, very dangerous situation when you have this many elite institutions, the Democratic Party, most of the corporate media, the universities, almost just virtually all of them, corporations who fund the media, but also who provide tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to organizations like Black Lives Matter. That you're in a very dangerous time when you have these type of organizations who are explicitly supporting people going outside the political process in order to apply pressure for the policies and other things that they want. And the 2020 was really the culmination of that. It was something that, the 2020 riots, when when we'd all been locked in our houses, for a couple months by that point, told that like, you'll get arrested if you take your kid to the park, and you can't get near anybody or we're all going to die. And then all of a sudden you've got like 50 million people on the streets or something. And it's not just like shill politicians or celebrities, but public health officials who are coming out and saying, oh, nope. That's when, that is an indication that, you're dealing with something much more than just people's sort of emotional responses. I mean, it's hard to look at what was going on in 2020 as anything other than a sort of explosion of left-wing paramilitaries, even if they didn't recognize themselves as that at the time. That's how they were used. A lot of the people, if you go to like, the color revolutions that we put on in like Ukraine, for example, a lot of the people who were there at Maidan, they're not there to like carry out America's color revolution. They've been propagandized into going out there for the cause, And so it doesn't necessarily speak to the motivations of all the people who were out there in 2020. But the fact of the matter is like that they are tools of the regime. And, you're in a dark place when the regime is not just using, say, police or military or official institutions against you, which in a way is less scary. It really is, because, obviously they're more efficient and powerful killers than the mob. But there's some structure to the violence there, and you can address it in a sort of, maybe you could take back power. Maybe you could influence the people who control it and convince them this is a bad idea. It's going to damage your legitimacy or whatever. When people are, weaponizing segments of the population against the rest of the population, that's a very dangerous thing. And I think the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict was, in a lot of ways, the reason should really be celebrating it. Isn't just that, well, the main reason is that innocent kid isn't going to spend the rest of his life in jail. Is that, hey, say what you want about like how degraded we are as a country and political culture right now. But this is still a country where the entire media, virtually, a major political party, the one that's in control of the presidency, the president himself, the party that's in control of Congress, and the party that most of the bureaucrats and most of the people who are like the managerial class, every single one of those people wanted that kid's head. But at the end of the day, they don't get to choose. They still don't get to choose. And like, at the end of the day, it comes down to 12 people who are his peers who get to make that decision. And I'm usually like, Spengler is like my most influential writer. I read him back when I was in my late teens, and he's just left an indelible, like, deep mark. So I can get pretty like pessimistic. Optimism is cowardice, like a lot of the times. But I'll tell you what, that is something that we should keep in mind, is that in virtually every country throughout history, and in most countries in the world today, the fact that all those people wanted his head would have been enough. And it's still not enough here. And that is something to hold on to and something to fight for.
Yeah, there's a layer of scale that politics gets with technology, and this essentially rule by media that you have when all of these means are owned by the regime. You can't really describe it in any other way. There is one regime, that's it, and there's like a a mascot outer party that's doing its bidding as
Yes.
well. Um, yeah, I mean, one thing that might make me hopeful a little bit is that um, I've listened to a few of your other podcasts, and then you describe your life as having roots and like a tough childhood, and I mean we won't go into detail because you've expounded on that in other podcasts, but um, I feel like that's kind of influenced you on a personal level to understand the value of order, to understand why these values are useful. And I feel like, and it looks like, we're heading for lean times, and things are going to get tougher before they get better. And I feel like a lot of people are going to have personal collisions with disorder. Because for me, that was essentially, that's also what Curtis Yarvin says. There's nothing that's going to make you more right wing than me coming from like a little small town in Romania and going to like a big city like London and seeing the level of urban crime that was just like rampant around me, and the silence, the like imposed silence on that, and the fact that if you manage to coast by without getting stabbed or mugged, call yourself lucky, and just shut up about it. And that was just too much of a cognitive dissonance for me, and that's from that point I turned. I was like, no, 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 we need to explore why this is happening, because it's too crazy. So I feel like more and more people are going to have that experience, hopefully. Please do.
Yeah.
And that's I think that's the biggest red pill, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah, my experience has definitely made me appreciate order, as well as so I was in the military for 10 years, but then also I worked for the Department of Defense for 10 years after that. And I spent 6, 7, 8 months of the year, sometimes 10 months a year, traveling overseas, a lot of time in the Middle East and East Africa and other places. So I've seen, you know, I've seen enough of the rest of the world to understand that, like, what we have here, this is not some natural occurrence. This is a hothouse plant that needs a very specific environment and needs care and feeding. And without any of those things, this reverts to nature. And nature is not, Bel Air. Nature is Kabul. That's nature. And so it definitely made me appreciate that, and also, like, growing up the way I did, it helped me very much appreciate recognize the social pathologies that result from a lot of the things that we call liberation. That when you're dealing with people who, are at the margins or in the lower class, that, a lot of the time, these are people who are profoundly influenced by propaganda, they just, there's, you need a ruling class. Well, you call it that anymore. I mean, it's so ridiculous because, like, we don't even have, like, anything that could, like, remotely be called elites in any real sense anymore. Everybody's kind of similarly degraded, but, like, you do need to have, like, a ruling class, for lack of a better term, that models behavior for people in general, because people naturally gravitate toward high status behavior. And that's just, we can say, like, you can argue people into it or, like, represent the position, but the reality is that people gravitate toward high status behavior. And, when, when you have a ruling class that largely is not preaching what it practices, as Charles Murray says, I have a great appreciation for how that shakes out at the bottom of the scale.
Yeah, that's it's one of those things that you kind of have to live through to really experience, to see what happens, and to see what it means to wreck the societal commons, the moral commons of a society, and how it trickles down to some people. A lot of intellectuals and people who talk for a living or write for a living imagine that life is like writing an op-ed. You measure different areas. You I don't know, toy with different arguments. You put yourself in the shoes of your opponent, and you come to a very refined conclusion of what you should do. Most people just are going through life trying to make ends meet and survive and feed their children, and they really don't have time to literally think about this stuff. And I feel like, the problem with liberalism is that you can't really say that. You can't really say that people are irrational about their day to day. They're not thinking about things, because that collapses the idea of democracy. Because if most people are uninformed voters and they just vote with their instincts, then or whatever propaganda they're fed, then oh my God, what does that say about the system? So this is another big thing that we shouldn't talk about, but it's obvious. And the problem is that because liberalism has this idea baked into it, they've made it acceptable to rip down these moral commons, and it's still going on, and it's
really one of the things that, one of my biggest gripes with libertarians. I'm thinking about writing an open letter to libertarians. Dave Smith said he'd read it and talk to me about it if I did. So there's a lot of things to gripe about with libertarians, right? But the primary one, or if you had to boil it down, I think my gripe with them is I basically libertarian instincts. If I were the emperor, you would all live in basically a libertarian society. All right. But libertarianism is not something that just results naturally when you take away the institutions and structures of power, right? You have to actually create a society that is capable of fostering and sustaining liberty over the long term. And so a libertarian, they always stop at the first order of consequences, right? They go around and they look for and identify instances of coercion, and they say, aha, that's an instance of coercion. That should not happen. You're forcing somebody to do something they don't want to do, non-aggression principle, whatever. So this guy owns this factory in this Midwest town. It's his factory. It's private property. Why? If we start interfering with what people can do with their private property, it'll lead right down the road to serfdom. And so if he wants to move it to China, for a marginal profit increase, then that's his right to do. Perfectly logical. Hard to argue with that from a logical perspective if you're somebody who at base level values liberty, as most Americans do. But what happens when you do that in that town, and another town, and another town, another town, and it happens across the country? And now what you have is you had a community of people with stable lives, with intact families, with a low level of social pathology. And that's actually a community of people that is perfectly capable of defending liberty over the long term and is probably interested in doing so. You take that factory away in the name of liberty, and now what do you have? You have broken families, you have a ruined community, you have people with unstable lives who have experienced an extreme dislocation in their lives, people with probably more alcohol problems, children that are going to be raised by these less intact families, and so on. That is not a society that's going to be either interested in or capable of defending liberty, right? And I mean, if the Libertarian Party, instead of being this sort of crusader unit that went around looking for instances of coercion to call them out, became a party or a movement that was interested in creating a society, building a society that could actually foster liberty on its own, I wouldn't become one of them, but I would support them, and that's just not where we're at. I mean, you have to do things that sometimes look like restrictions of liberty in order to build a society that's capable of sustaining it.
Exactly. And in a way, I feel like the definition of liberty that libertarians have is very deficient. It's just, liberty from, but then true liberty, in my perspective, is kind of that Aristotelian conception where you build yourself into something that an animal capable of being free. Because at base, if you are like the perfect leftist subject that's just continuously consuming all the things that are presented to you, you're not really very free. You're a slave to your urges, your clickbait, whatever they're feeding you. Even if you're a good consumer, you're very much a slave to the apparatus. But if you were to make yourself free, and I think this is essentially Jocko Willink's entire shtick is discipline is freedom, and it sounds kind of weird, obviously, because it's discipline is kind of you're self coercing yourself, but it's through that practice you actually do become free in a much more elevated sense, and I feel like that's definitely what's missing.
Where you have agency, right? Which is really what people want. I mean, and freedom, freedom's an empty space to be filled by something. Say freedom to what? Like really, like what liberty is like the freedom to choose what you're going to serve. That's really what it is, because you're going to serve something. That's serving nothing's not an option. Something will find you, and is it something that's going to suck you in and pull you in, or is it something that you're going to be able to choose based on the kind of life and world you're trying to build? And that's really what freedom is. And the idea that, freedom is freedom from all constraint and freedom from all obligations. I mean, golly, that's just I don't know who came up with that idea, but it's so patently insane to me that it's amazing that it ever caught on as well as it did.
Yeah, it's demonic. That's what it is. It's it's essentially the whisper of the serpent in the garden.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up on time here. I want to ask you the question of the show, which everyone gets asked.
I should have been ready for this. Go ahead.
Don't worry. It's just whatever comes up. I'm sure you have a lot of stuff behind you. I'm sure something will come up. I know Spengler is a big one. We're gonna say that. So the question is, a subversive thinker, someone who's influenced you that you'd recommend that people should check out, or you think it was a bit underrated.
Wow. Oh, wow. There's so many. I would say I could go on Spengler, but if I do, then we'll be here for another hour. So I'll actually tell you one of my absolute favorite books of all time. I've read it. I must have read it 10 times. It's an absolutely incredible book. It's a book of philosophy, but it's not dry. It's incredibly beautifully written. It's called Icarus Fallen by Chantal Del Sol, a French woman. Died a few years ago. It was written, I think, maybe in like 89 or 91, something like that. And the premise of the book that she starts with, that image of Icarus Fallen, is that we in the West are kind of, you have the story of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun, his waxed wings melted, and he fell down into the ocean and he drowned. And she says, okay, well, let's say he didn't fall into the ocean. Let's say that he fell down into a dumpster. And now this is a guy who like almost made it to the sun. He almost flew up to the sun. He had these dreams of that. And now he's covered in filth and his wings are gone. And now he has to like wake up the next day and live live a life in a world where he's not going up to reach the sun. That's not going to happen. He actually has to go get a job tomorrow and actually like build a life and make it work. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. A lot of people, think of all the bankers that jumped off buildings in, when the market crashed in 1929. These are probably people who had the resources even after the stock market crashed to go live a nice middle-class life, go be an accountant somewhere, and they had enough savings to but they just, Icarus couldn't get his life back together. And that's kind of where we're at collectively in a lot of ways. We thought we were going to build this perfect society, whether technology or democracy or whatever it was going to deliver us from everything. And the 20th century taught us that was never in the cards. And in fact, all of the things that we devoted ourselves to with the most moral fervor very often turned out to be pure evil when they were put into practice. And, again, it goes a lot to that lack of confidence that we have now to actually stand for something. And that's the book. Absolutely. I recommend that book to absolutely everyone, left, right, and center. I think everybody will love it. Chantal Del Sol, Icarus Fallen.
Excellent. Yeah, I haven't heard of that book yet. So this is
you in particular will like it very much.
Okay, perfect. I'll look it up. I mean, I'm waiting for that time where the baby sleeps through the night. Right?
Yeah, good luck.
I can recover my vitality and my reading potential, but soon, hopefully. So I just want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been a very, very good episode. Like I'm just like, now I'm just making little clips of it, and I'm like, yeah, everything should be a clip because this is just so packed with knowledge. I love it. And I want to direct everyone to the MartyrMade podcast and your podcast with Jocko Willing, which I haven't listened to yet, but I will soon, The Unraveling, and also the Substack, martyrmade.substack.com. Please do sign up for it. Excellent podcasts. A nice compliment to the Subversive podcast. Mostly these long, very well narrated, very well researched podcasts. It's excellent, and I just want to thank you for everything you do. It's Amazing work.
Thanks. Yeah, we can do this again sometime if you like. I know that I ran my mouth pretty much the entire time. So if there were questions or things you didn't want to cover that you didn't get to cover, we can do it again. So
excellent. Well, we definitely will. I'm excited to do it again, and I'm happy we ran your mouth because it was just really, really good stuff.
Great. I'm glad you liked it.